You grab a burger from a drive-through window. You pull out onto the highway, you unwrap it, and you just take a bite.
Right.
And as you're chewing, you probably think the biggest health risk in your hands is, I don't know, the calories in the meat? Or maybe the refined sugar baked into the bun?
Or the sodium. People always worry about the salt.
Exactly. You might even feel a little guilty about that sheer volume of salt. But what if the most biologically active ingredient you're consuming in that exact moment isn't the food at all?
Well, that's the thing. It usually isn't.
Right. What if the most powerful chemical instruction entering your body is actually migrating out of the grease-proof paper wrapper it came in?
It completely upends how we evaluate risk. We're so accustomed to just looking at a nutrition label to understand what we're putting into our biology.
Like 20 grams of fat, 15 grams of protein.
Yeah, exactly. But the most disruptive elements of the modern human diet, they don't actually have to be listed on a label. They are systemic byproducts of how the food is engineered, how it's packaged and preserved.
Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to explore this massive, really massive stack of recent medical studies, environmental audits, and even some philosophical essays centered entirely around the reality of modern food.
And it is a deeply unsettling reality when you look at it all together.
It really is, because, look, we all like to think we're in complete control of our choices, especially when it comes to what we put on our plates.
Right, you go to the store, you pick an item off the shelf, you pay for it.
It feels like total autonomy. It
Right.
feels like you're driving the ship. But the sources we're looking at today suggest something else entirely. The food itself and the materials wrapped around it are actively rewriting the body's internal code.
To really understand this, we have to let go of a metaphor that has just completely dominated mainstream nutritional science for decades.
You mean the engine metaphor?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have to stop viewing the human body as a combustion engine. For a very long time, the consensus was simply calories in, calories out.
You put fuel in the tank, you burn it off.
Right. A calorie of sugar was functionally viewed as the same as a calorie of protein, just, burned at a different rate.
Which is such a comforting, clean way to look at it. It turns eating into simple math.
It does. But the body is far more complex than a furnace. The research we're synthesizing today frames the human body as an incredibly sophisticated information processing system.
Like a computer network.
Essentially, yes, every bite you take is a data packet. It contains chemical instructions that tell your cells how to behave, what hormones to release, whether to store energy or expend it.
And what we are seeing with modern engineered foods, specifically ultra-processed foods, which we'll call UPFs today, and PFAS, widely known as forever chemicals, is that they're introducing a corrupted code into that information system.
A deeply corrupted code.
So we're analyzing two massive intertwined subjects today, UPFs and forever chemicals.
Yeah.
And the core premise across all these sources is that these are not just individual isolated health risks.
Right. If you eat a bad piece of fish, you get an upset stomach. That's an isolated risk.
Exactly. What we are talking about today is systemic engineering. It's a top-to-bottom alteration of the very environment we live in.
What's fascinating here is how the recent audits and medical data connect the absolute micro level, like the molecular signaling in our digestive tract, to the macro level of global supply chains.
And trillion-dollar marketing logistics.
Yes, and international regulatory frameworks. You simply cannot separate the biology from the economics anymore.
So let's start at the physical point of contact, the gut. Because when we talk about eating, obviously, that is the front line.
It's the gateway for everything.
But the sources point out something crucial right off the bat that I really want to challenge. They say ultra-processed foods don't arrive in our bodies as traditional food. They arrive as complex chemical formulations.
Yes, formulations is the perfect word for it.
We're talking about emulsifiers, stabilizers, synthetic texturizers. Now, hold on. I get that a neon orange snack cake isn't a piece of broccoli. But humans have been processing food, like salting meat, curing fish, fermenting vegetables, for thousands of years. Why is the gut suddenly treating modern emulsifiers like a hostile alien invasion?
That is the essential distinction to make right there. Traditional processing, salting, smoking, fermenting, that operates at the macro level.
Okay.
You're using natural compounds or bacteria to preserve the gross structure of the food. But ultra-processing operates at the molecular level.
So it's fundamentally different.
Entirely. An emulsifier, for instance, is a molecule specifically designed to force water and oil to mix.
Because in nature, water and lipid fats just repel each other.
Exactly. They separate. Emulsifiers break down that boundary so that a factory-made pastry can sit on a shelf for 6 months and its internal fats don't separate and rise to the surface.
So it's basically an industrial soap.
Functionally, yes, it is a detergent for your food.
Wow.
But the human digestive tract, which, took millions of years to evolve, relies heavily on a delicate natural boundary called the mucosal barrier.
Right, the gut is not just a hollow tube where food magically dissolves.
Not at all. It's lined with this thick layer of mucus that protects the actual epithelial cells of your intestine from the trillions of bacteria living inside you.
So this boundary is the translator between the external world, the food you swallowed, and your internal biology.
Exactly. And what happens when an industrial soap hits that delicate mucus boundary?
I'm guessing it doesn't just pass quietly.
The effects are aggressive and highly measurable. In the recent 2024 Cell Metabolism randomized controlled trials, they examined common emulsifiers.
And what did they find?
The data demonstrated that these compounds physically disrupt the mucosal barrier in the gut within just a few days of consumption.
Just a few days.
Yes. They essentially wash away that protective mucus layer. And when that happens, the tight junctions between your intestinal cells, they start to loosen and physically pull apart.
Increasing intestinal permeability. I think some people call that leaky gut, right?
Yes, that's the common term. And this leads to a condition documented in the medical literature as metabolic endotoxemia.
Metabolic endotoxemia. Okay, break that down for us.
Because the barrier is compromised, elements that are strictly supposed to remain inside the digestive tract begin crossing over into the systemic circulation of your bloodstream.
The sources specifically mention lipopolysaccharides making this crossover. Wait, before we move on, what exactly is a lipopolysaccharide?
We usually just call them LPS.
Okay, so if LPS is just a random piece of debris from a bacteria cell wall, why does my immune system care so much if it slips into the bloodstream?
Because an LPS is essentially the chemical signature of a hostile bacterial invasion. Your immune system has evolved over millennia to recognize LPS as a massive existential threat.
So it panics.
Total panic. When immune cells like macrophages detect LPS floating in the bloodstream, they don't know that it just leaked through a weakened gut lining.
They don't know you just ate a processed muffin.
Right. They assume you are suffering from a massive life-threatening infection. So they instantly release inflammatory cytokines. They sound the biological alarm.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy. It's like the gut lining is the security team at an exclusive nightclub. The bouncers are supposed to be checking IDs, keeping the rough crowd out on the street, and only letting the VIPs the nutrients into the club, which is your bloodstream.
I like that. That's a good way to visualize it.
But these ultra-processed emulsifiers come along, and they don't just sneak past the bouncer. They essentially bribe the bouncer, dissolve the velvet rope, and prop the back door wide open.
Exactly.
So the bad guys, these lipopolysaccharides, wander into the club. And it's not just that they're trespassing. The moment they get inside, the immune system sees them, completely panics, pulls the fire alarms, and starts smashing the bar to get rid of them.
Yes.
And that chaotic internal riot that is systemic inflammation.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. The fire alarms are constantly ringing, and it's a low-grade chronic alarm.
So you don't necessarily feel sick.
Right. You don't necessarily spike a fever, but your immune system is locked in a state of perpetual hypervigilance. It's exhausting for the body.
And to make matters worse, we aren't just dealing with the engineered food formulations, are we?
No, we aren't. This is where the environmental audits concerning PFAS enter the picture, because the packaging itself is an active participant in this biochemical disruption.
This was the part of the data that really stopped me in my tracks.
Yeah.
Because you look at a burger wrapper or a fast food clamshell box or a microwave popcorn bag.
And you just think of it as the vehicle.
Yeah. It's just the thing keeping the food clean or, keeping the grease off your car seat.
But the reality is far more insidious. The 2025 Environmental Health Perspectives study confirmed the measurable migration of PFAS compounds directly from grease-resistant wrappers into the food itself.
Wait, so the chemical literally leaves the paper?
Yes. The heat of the food, combined with the lipid content, the grease acts as a perfect extraction mechanism. The forever chemicals leave the paper and bind to the food.
And then you eat it.
You ingest them, and they elevate the serum concentrations of PFAS in your blood.
And once these synthetic chemicals are in the blood, I'm assuming they don't just float around passively doing nothing.
Far from it. PFAS compounds are notorious endocrine disruptors.
Meaning they mess with hormones.
Exactly. They interfere with your body's hormonal signaling. Specifically, the latest data shows they disrupt the GLP-1 pathways.
The GLP-1 pathways. Okay, this is incredibly relevant right now with all the new weight loss drugs on the market targeting GLP-1. Let's explain how this actually works naturally in the body. GLP-1 is the hormone responsible for satiety, right?
Correct. The feeling of being full.
Yeah, okay.
When you eat a nutrient-dense meal, your intestines release GLP-1. This hormone travels up to your brain, specifically to the hypothalamus, and delivers a very clear message.
Which is what?
It says, we have acquired sufficient energy. You can stop feeling hungry now. It is a vital biological stop sign.
But the forever chemicals mess that up.
Yes. When PFAS compounds infiltrate the bloodstream, they interfere with the receptors meant to receive that signal. The communication network is physically jammed.
Wow. So the bouncer's corrupted, the bad guys are running wild in the club, causing massive inflammation, and the fire alarm system has been disconnected from the main control panel.
That is the biochemical reality of a modern fast food meal, yes.
Your stomach might be physically stretched to its absolute limit. You might have consumed well over 1,000 calories in a single sitting, but the biochemical signal saying stop simply never arrives at the brain.
It never arrives, and we are seeing the results of this biological disruption on a massive population-wide scale. The mucosal damage and the hormonal jamming are no longer isolated incidents.
Yeah, look at the 2025 meta-analysis published in the Gut Journal. They tracked massive cohorts and linked higher ultra-processed food intake to a 23% increased risk of developing Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis.
A 23% increase. That is a staggering jump for population-level data.
It really is. That means severe chronic inflammation in the digestive tract is no longer a genetic anomaly for a tiny subset of people. It is actively becoming the baseline biological pattern for the modern population.
Because the damage is cumulative. The gut barrier weakens slightly more with every single exposure. The inflammatory signals rise incrementally.
And the hormonal feedback loops just lose their precision over time.
Exactly. The body gradually stops responding to clear biological cues and starts responding entirely to chemical noise. And the most insidious part is that you don't consciously feel this code being rewritten.
Right. There is no dashboard light that blinks and warns you that your intestinal permeability has increased.
You just experience it as a vague chronic fatigue, a baseline level of digestive discomfort that you just accept as normal.
And most notably, intense cravings that seem to make absolutely no logical sense. Which brings us to the next massive piece of this puzzle.
This raises an important question. If our neurochemistry is being hijacked so effectively at the gut level, we have to look at the brain.
Right. If the physical barrier is compromised and the stop signs for fullness are physically distorted by chemical wrappers, what is actually happening up in the brain when it receives these corrupted signals?
That leads directly into the neurological studies and the sources, and it requires us to completely reevaluate the concept of craving. Because culturally, we have a very specific, deeply ingrained narrative about junk food.
We view it through a moral lens.
Absolutely, we do.
If you've ever found yourself staring at the bottom of an empty chip bag, wondering how you ate the entire family-sized portion when you weren't even really hungry, you probably blamed yourself. We call it a lack of willpower.
We assume the person simply lacks discipline.
But the clinical data argues something entirely different, doesn't it?
It completely dismantles that idea. The concept of willpower is a social construct designed around the idea of conscious, rational choice. But the human reward system did not evolve for conscious restraint.
What did it evolve for?
It evolved over millions of years to reinforce survival behaviors, finding calorie-dense food in a scarce environment, storing that energy as fat, and surviving the winter. That is what the brain fundamentally wants.
So it's operating on ancient software.
Yes. And ultra-processed foods do not interact with this ancient survival system the way an apple or a handful of nuts or a piece of grilled meat does. UPFs don't just satisfy a hunger deficit, they actively hijack the neurological mechanism.
I know hijack sounds like hyperbole, but the data completely backs up that specific word. Let's talk about the functional MRI imaging that the 2024 Nature Neuroscience studies utilized. What did they actually do in these trials?
So they placed individuals inside fMRI machines, which measure brain activity by detecting changes associated with blood flow.
The Boldy signal, right? Blood oxygen level dependent imaging.
Exactly. They mapped the participants' brain activity when they were exposed to ultra-processed foods versus whole foods, and the results were stark.
How so?
The ultra-processed formulations produce significantly greater, faster activation in the nucleus accumbens.
And the nucleus accumbens is the brain's primary reward and reinforcement center.
Right. It's the exact same area that lights up in addiction models. And the dopamine response they measured wasn't just a slight elevation. The researchers noted that the neurochemical reward generated by these foods is entirely disproportionate to the body's actual caloric need.
Because the food is engineered in laboratories. It's not grown in a field.
Exactly. Manufacturers spend billions optimizing the exact ratios of salt, sugar, and fat. They often call it the bliss point.
The bliss point. That just sounds sinister when you really think about it.
It is deeply calculated. They combine this bliss point with specific color additives, flavor enhancers, and texture modifiers that dissolve perfectly on the tongue. It creates an illusion of lacking calories.
Ah, so it melts away before you even register you're eating it.
Right. It is meticulously designed to hit the brain's reward center like a sledgehammer before the digestive process even truly begins.
But the initial sledgehammer hit is just the beginning, right? Because the real trap is what happens to the brain after repeated exposure. How does the brain adapt to being hit with that sledgehammer every single day?
This is where the biochemistry becomes truly alarming. The 2025 addiction biology study looked at the long-term neuroadaptation. They found that certain emulsifiers, the exact same compounds we just discussed shredding the gut barrier, actually have a secondary effect.
Wait, really? The emulsifiers affect the brain too?
Yes, they travel via the bloodstream, or influence signals sent up the vagus nerve, and actively alter dopamine sensitization in the brain over time.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let me make sure I'm translating this correctly. Dopamine sensitization. You get a massive dopamine spike from the engineered food. But the brain doesn't like being overstimulated.
No, it seeks homeostasis, balance.
Right, so it protects itself by downregulating, or basically turning off, some of its own dopamine receptors. Which means the more of this ultra-processed food we eat, the more we numb our own natural receptors.
Precisely. It actively lowers the threshold for reward activation. Your brain adapts to the extreme artificial stimulus by making it harder to feel pleasure from normal stimuli.
So a normal, perfectly ripe piece of fruit no longer registers as a reward.
It barely registers at all.
A home-cooked meal feels boring or flat. You literally need the massive engineered input of synthetic flavors and refined carbohydrates just to reach a baseline feeling of normal satisfaction.
You aren't eating for pleasure anymore. You're eating to avoid the deficit, to avoid the chemical low.
Wow.
And you have to remember that this neurological downregulation is happening simultaneously with the hormonal blinding we discussed earlier.
Right, the GLP-1 disruption from the forever chemicals.
Exactly. And the 2025 toxicological sciences research demonstrated that alongside GLP-1 disruption, PFAS exposure also alters thyroid function and leptin signaling.
Leptin's another crucial hormone, right?
Yes. Produced by your fat cells, it tells the brain how much energy you have stored.
So let's look at the complete biological picture here. Your dopamine system is screaming, I'm understimulated, give me more salt and sugar just so I can feel normal.
Right.
Meanwhile, your GLP-1 and leptin systems, which are supposed to say, stop, we have thousands of calories stored, are physically jammed by the chemical packaging.
The internal cues of the human animal become entirely unreliable. Hunger persists way beyond any biological need.
And satisfaction diminishes despite massive, continuous caloric intake. It's a perfect engineered storm.
It is. And when you zoom out from the fMRI machines and look at the macro-level economic data, it is jarring.
Yeah, the numbers are insane. We're talking about global spending on ultra-processed food marketing exceeding $1.2 trillion annually.
$1.2 trillion spent explicitly on pushing these optimized bliss point formulations.
And perfectly in parallel with that expenditure, clinical diagnostics show an 18% rise in documented compulsive eating disorders across populations.
The correlation is simply impossible to ignore. Now, the relationship between marketing spend and complex psychological disorders might not be a perfectly simple straight line, but the overlap of the vectors is incredibly consistent.
You have a vulnerable human neurochemical response meeting total environmental saturation.
You have biological reward pathways that evolved for scarcity meeting meticulously engineered, hyperabundant input. The result is not an accident.
It's the inevitable math of neurochemical response meeting environmental saturation.
Exactly. The result is exactly what the industrial system is designed to produce, which is repetition. The goal is not human nourishment. The goal is relentless, predictable repetition of consumption.
I had this exact realization recently. I went to the store to buy oat milk. I was specifically trying to make a quote-unquote healthy choice,
Hmm.
moving away from dairy, buying into the marketing of this clean, plant-based alternative.
Then what did you see on the label?
I went to the back of the carton, and right there on the ingredient list, it's packed with potassium phosphate and synthetic gums.
The exact emulsifiers we're talking about.
Even when you try to opt out, the trap is waiting for you under a different logo.
Which brings us to the logistics of how this food actually reaches us. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the trap is not just biochemical, it is deeply infrastructural.
Right. Because if our neurochemistry is being hijacked so effectively, it makes me wonder why we can't just outsmart it.
Just choose to buy something else.
Exactly. Just make a list, go to the grocery store, and only buy perimeter items, vegetables, raw meats. But when you look at the logistics network, the actual physical way food is distributed across society, it seems like that choice is already made for us before we even park the car.
Or does the environment prevent us from making that choice at all?
Let's talk about the supply chain, because the sources refer to this as the infrastructure of convenience. But for millions of people, convenience is a highly misleading word.
Because it implies a luxury. It implies you have the option to do it the hard way if you wanted to.
But the sources focus heavily on what they call the long-haul machine, the vast transportation and logistics networks that keep modern civilization functioning. We're talking about truck drivers, overnight freight loaders, third-shift warehouse workers, delivery couriers.
For these demographics, food is not chosen from a farmer's market. It is merely accessed within a highly constrained radius.
The physical environment of the logistics network does not pause. Freight moves continuously, whether the human body running the machine is well-rested or not.
And in that environment, the architecture of food access is remarkably rigid. Highway truck stops, industrial park vending machines, and brightly lit 24-hour convenience stores are not incidental retail locations.
They are vital load-bearing infrastructure.
They exist exactly where the labor exists, and what they provide is incredibly mathematically consistent, ultra-processed, shelf-stable, and immediately consumable.
The recent 2025 Occupational and Environmental Medicine cohort study really put devastating numbers to this reality. They ran a massive study tracking over 8,400 transport workers over a multi-year period. What did they find when they looked at the medical outcomes of the long-haul machine?
They documented a 41% higher incidence of metabolic disease among these workers compared to baseline populations in other industries.
41% higher.
And that correlation tracked directly with their on-road food access patterns. The physical reality of their job heavily dictated their biological breakdown.
Describe the reality of that job, because I think a lot of people who work 9-to-5 desk jobs just don't fully grasp the constraints. We often judge people for eating poorly.
We do. We look at rising obesity or metabolic disease rates, and we casually think, why don't they just pack a salad? Why don't they just meal prep?
That judgment completely ignores the operational reality of the system.
Imagine a long-haul truck driver. They operate under strict electronic logging devices, or ELDs. Their time is tracked to the exact minute by federal regulations.
They can't just take an hour for lunch?
No, they pull an 80,000-pound vehicle into a concrete lot at 3 a.m. in the freezing rain. They have been driving for 10 hours. Their mandated rest clock is already ticking.
They have perhaps 30 minutes to secure a meal, use the restroom, and get to sleep before their next shift begins.
And what are their options? There is no fresh produce stand open at 3 a.m. on Interstate 80. The options are entirely contained within glowing glass boxes. Roller grill hot dogs, foil-lined bags of extruded corn snacks, and high-fructose energy drinks.
If you're a long-haul driver pulling in at 3 a.m., your only options are lit up in a vending machine. Is that really a choice?
It is the absolute illusion of choice. The worker is allowed to choose which ultra-processed item they consume, but they cannot choose to opt out of the ultra-processed category entirely.
And if we layer in the NAAE's data, it reveals an even deeper layer of exposure.
Yes, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. This is where the wrapper data comes back to haunt us.
Because they're not just eating the processed food, they're eating it out of the chemical packaging.
Exactly. The NAAE's data shows vastly elevated PFAS body burdens in these exact same transportation demographics, because the chemical exposure isn't just from eating one fast food burger occasionally.
It accumulates.
It accumulates through the constant daily reliance on the packaging, the thermal receipt paper they handle at the fuel pumps, the grease-resistant wrappers they eat from in the cab, the constant endless repetition mandated by their work schedules.
The tragic irony here is that from a purely corporate logistical perspective, the current system is completely flawless. It is incredibly efficient for profit.
Oh, absolutely. Calories are dense and cheap to produce. Storage requires no special handling. Distribution is totally seamless because nothing rots.
And the profit margins are enormous.
Hmm.
But fresh food, a piece of grilled chicken, an apple, a bag of raw spinach, that introduces massive friction into the profit model.
Friction is the enemy of the modern supply chain. Fresh food spoils. It requires the cold chain refrigerated trucks, temperature-controlled warehouses, constant monitoring.
It requires human labor to prepare. It takes time to eat.
Time is the one metric the logistics network simply does not allow for. The current model removes all biological friction. The food is practically pre-digested through industrial processing, wrapped in forever chemicals, and ready to consume with one hand on the steering wheel in under 60 seconds.
The human body simply adapts to what is repeated. The mucosal barrier weakens. The inflammation rises. The hormones blur.
But the route continues. The freight has to arrive.
The supply chain literally holds itself together at the direct expense of the cellular health of the people running it.
Which naturally leads us to a massive structural question.
Right.
If the physical damage to the gut is clinical fact, if the neurochemical hijacking of the brain is visible on fMRI scans, and if the environmental trap is evident to anyone who has ever visited a gas station, how did these novel synthetic substances bypass safety regulators in the first place?
Because you would think, given the stakes, there must be a giant red button in Washington or Geneva that someone can push to stop this?
You want to believe there's a specific villain twirling a mustache, explicitly plotting to poison the food supply.
But the sources point out that reality is far more bureaucratic. They describe what is called the liability firewall. Let's talk about the regulatory illusion.
The liability firewall is a conceptual framework that explains how deeply entrenched systems protect themselves. It operates as a complex, decentralized network.
Responsibility is intentionally diffused.
Exactly. When regulatory systems are layered with industry input, third-party review, governmental advisory panels, and voluntary post-market surveillance, each layer holds only a tiny, fragmented fraction of the authority.
Which means no single point holds total accountability when something goes wrong. They co-create plausible deniability.
Let's get specific about how this actually works in the United States. We have to talk about the GRAS loophole. GRAS, generally recognized as safe.
This is arguably the most important acronym in the modern food supply. Where does this come from, and how is it being used today?
The history of GRAS is fascinating because it began with logical intentions. In 1958, the U.S. government passed the Food Additives Amendment. They realized they needed to regulate new chemicals entering the food supply.
Makes sense.
But they also realized it would be absurd to demand millions of dollars in clinical safety testing for common historical ingredients like table salt, vinegar, or baking soda.
Right. So they created a category, generally recognized as safe.
If an ingredient had a long history of common use, it bypassed the strict pre-market approval process.
Which makes sense for vinegar. But how did we go from vinegar to synthetic emulsifiers and chemical dough conditioners?
Over the decades, the GRAS pathway became a loophole for modern chemical formulations. Today, a food manufacturer can essentially self-determine the safety of a novel additive.
Wait, self-determine?
Yes. They convene their own panel of experts, conduct their own internal review, and declare their new emulsifier or texturizer to be self-affirmed GRAS.
That is wild. They can introduce these substances into the global food supply, often without any mandatory, independent, long-term testing conducted by the FDA prior to market entry.
Exactly.
The fox is essentially installing the security system for the henhouse. And even when the government does get involved to review the data, it gets incredibly murky. Look at the 2025 Government Accountability Office audit, the GAO audit of FDA safety evaluations.
They looked at the underlying studies that regulatory agencies rely on to determine if an additive is safe.
Do you know what they found? I read this and I couldn't believe it. 87% of those studies referenced in FDA safety evaluations were industry funded. 87%.
Now, we need to be incredibly precise and impartial here, just as the sources are. An industry-funded study does not automatically invalidate the underlying science.
Sure.
The scientists conducting the assays in the labs are generally doing their jobs according to standard protocols. But relying to that extreme extent on industry funding introduces an undeniable structural bias into our baseline understanding of food safety.
What does structural bias actually look like in this context? Because it's not scientists falsifying data in dark rooms.
No, it's far more subtle. Structural bias manifests in the parameters of the study design. What do they specifically choose to look for? What endpoints are they measuring? And crucially, how long do they run the trials?
Right, the timeline.
If an industry-funded study is designed to test a new synthetic emulsifier for exactly 90 days in an animal model, and they find no acute toxicity, they declare it safe.
But a 90-day trial is completely blind to the effects of consuming that exact same emulsifier every single day for 2 decades.
Exactly. The slow erosion of the gut barrier, the creeping dopamine downregulation, these are long-term systemic failures that simply do not appear in short-term toxicity screens.
And the regulatory blind spots aren't just limited to the food additives either. The firewall extends directly to the packaging, specifically the PFAS forever chemicals.
The 2026 litigation documents that were unsealed recently are incredibly revealing on this point.
These corporate documents revealed that certain chemical manufacturers explicitly knew about the migration of PFAS from their packaging materials into the food supply under normal, everyday conditions.
They tested it, they had the data, they knew the migration was occurring.
Yet, because of the fragmented regulatory landscape, the reporting of these chemical migrations remains largely voluntary in many jurisdictions.
Even when threshold limits are suggested, they are frequently non-binding guidelines rather than strict legal mandates.
The knowledge of the contamination exists deeply within the industry, but the liability firewall prevents that knowledge from translating into immediate, sweeping regulatory action.
And even when massive, highly respected, independent scientific bodies try to ring the alarm, they just get bogged down in the bureaucracy.
Look at the 2025 Lancet Commission on Ultra-Processed Foods. This was a massive, global, comprehensive evaluation of the physiological dangers we've been discussing today. And what was the result?
Systemic delays, decades-long calls for further research, extremely limited policy integration.
The regulatory system doesn't flat out deny the risk. Denying it would invite a fight. They just distribute the risk across so many different interagency panels, working groups, and endless timelines that no one is left holding the bag.
The bureaucratic structure itself becomes the shield. By the time the physiological patterns become mathematically undeniable at the population level, the chemical compounds and the industrial food systems are so deeply embedded into global commerce that extracting them seems economically impossible.
But this administrative delay shifts the timeline in a really profound, terrifying way.
If the regulators aren't stopping it today, what happens to the generations of tomorrow who are inheriting this chemical legacy?
This is where we have to issue a warning. I want to warn everyone listening. This next segment is particularly heavy. We are looking at how these systemic exposures do not end with the individual consumer. The damage is being passed down the bloodline.
The biological reality is that exposure does not end when you put the fork down or when you throw the wrapper away. The exposure continues. What enters one body does not necessarily leave with it.
The 2026 CDC ATSDR update, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, confirmed a deeply unsettling mechanism. Let's talk about the biological inheritance.
The ATSDR update confirmed that PFAS compounds, the forever chemicals migrating from the packaging, do not just circulate in the mother's bloodstream and then eventually flush out.
Yeah.
They cross the placental barrier.
The body's ultimate defense mechanism for a developing child, and the chemicals just slip right through.
Yes, they cross the placenta and accumulate directly in fetal tissue. And the defining characteristic of these specific synthetic chemicals is their durability.
Right. They're called forever chemicals for a reason.
They are built with carbon-fluorine bonds, which are some of the strongest chemical bonds in organic chemistry. They actively resist degradation. They have biological half-lives that can be measured in decades.
Up to 40 years for certain compounds to clear the system.
They do not magically dissipate between generations. They carry forward. A mother's ambient environmental exposure effectively becomes the baseline chemical burden for the developing child before they even take their first breath.
And it isn't just the ambient chemical exposure, it's the ultra-processed diet itself. There was a massive 2025 JAMA Pediatrics longitudinal cohort study recently published that really brought this into focus.
That study was groundbreaking.
They tracked over 14,000 participants' mothers and their children over a span of years. And the researchers found a direct dose-dependent relationship between maternal in utero exposure to UPFs and the onset of childhood metabolic syndrome.
Dose-dependent is the key phrase there, meaning the higher the mother's intake of ultra-processed formulations during pregnancy, the higher the measurable risk markers in her offspring.
We are now seeing young children, born with predispositions to insulin resistance, significantly higher body mass index trajectories, and elevated baseline inflammatory profiles.
It is a fundamental shift in baseline health.
So we really need to pause and clarify what this actually means. We aren't just talking about learned family eating habits, right?
No, not at all.
It's not the psychological mechanism of, oh, mom likes eating fast food, so there's always fast food in the house and the kid learns to like it. We are talking about biological programming happening in the womb.
Exactly. We are talking about epigenetics.
Give us the absolute ELI 5, explain like a 5 breakdown of epigenetics. So what does this all mean? How does what a mother or father eats actually change the biology of the child?
To understand epigenetics, think of your DNA not as a rigid computer code, but as a massive ancient library of architectural blueprints. The genes are the blueprints themselves.
Okay.
They contain the instructions to build a healthy metabolism, a strong gut lining, a balanced neurochemical reward system. And those blueprints, the DNA sequence itself, do not change. The hardware is fixed.
Right.
But epigenetic changes are like someone walking through that massive library and permanently turning off the lights in specific aisles or putting padlocks on certain filing cabinets.
So the blueprint is still sitting there on the shelf, but the body's construction workers can no longer see it or read it.
Precisely. And the specific mechanism the sources highlight is called methylation. Methylation is a biological process where tiny chemical tags methyl groups, which are just one carbon and 3 hydrogen atoms, physically attached to the DNA molecule.
And what happens when they attach?
When they attach, they effectively block the cellular machinery from reading that gene. They turn the gene off.
Wow.
The research strongly indicates that the relentless chemical exposures from PFAS, combined with the inflammatory stress of ultra-processed dietary patterns, actively alter these methylation pathways. Both maternal and paternal exposures to this modern chemical environment are changing the gene expression in their offspring.
That is staggering. Paternal exposure, too. It's not just the mother's burden. The sources specifically mention that studies have now detected ubiquitous PFAS contamination in human breast milk and widely reproducible contamination in sperm samples across multiple diverse global populations.
These aren't isolated fringe cases of industrial accidents. This is the new global baseline.
Which represents the ultimate generational tax. What began as corporate convenience and shelf stability has literally translated into baseline biology for the next generation.
One generation consumes the convenience, and the subsequent generation inherits the corrupted code.
It's a terrifying synthesis of everything we've talked about today, taking all of this data from the microscopic breakdown of the gut biome to the neurological hijacking of the brain, to the supply chains trapping workers, to the regulators looking the other way, all the way to the generational changes in our DNA.
It leads to a massive, unavoidable philosophical question. What does this comprehensive system actually do to our fundamental autonomy as human beings?
That is the philosophical core of the essays we are analyzing alongside the medical data. Because choice assumes clarity, doesn't it?
It fundamentally assumes clarity. To make a free, autonomous choice about what you eat or how you govern your health assumes that the biological signals guiding your decisions are intact.
It assumes your stomach is communicating accurately, and your brain is interpreting those signals without artificial distortion.
But if we review the full loop of what we've uncovered in the data today, the physical gut barrier, the bouncer at the club, is weakened and breached by emulsifiers.
The hormonal feedback loops, the GLP-1 and leptin signals that tell you you've had enough, are physically jammed by other chemicals migrating from the wrappers.
The neurochemistry in your brain is hijacked, driving rapid dopamine downregulation to demand relentless repeat consumption just to feel normal.
The physical supply chains are designed to force absolute dependency on these exact foods due to time constraints and friction.
The regulatory agencies look away, completely shielded by the plausible deniability of the liability firewall.
And the resulting biological damage is pre-programmed into the gene expression of unborn children.
When you look at the architecture of that entire loop, you realize that if the body's baseline signals for hunger, satisfaction, and energy are artificially altered by the environment, the conscious mind is simply interpreting corrupted data.
The structure of this dependency isn't enforced by an authoritarian government holding a gun to your head and forcing you to eat.
It is vastly more efficient than that. It is maintained entirely internally. It is maintained by a biology that simply no longer functions normally.
You eat, but hunger persists. You rest, but fatigue remains. You think you're making a choice, but the options are pre-shaped.
Dependency is maintained internally.
The erosion of your autonomy isn't some sudden dramatic loss of freedom that you can protest in the streets. It's something that vanishes quietly, invisibly, bite by bite, every single day.
It represents a profound shift in how we must understand our relationship with the built environment.
Which leaves us with a heavy, lingering thought to process. If our very internal signals, the physical feelings of hunger, the psychological feelings of fullness, our most basic animal instincts, have been fundamentally compromised by the environment we build, how do we begin to rebuild trust with our own bodies?
That is the real challenge.
Is it even possible to individually detox from a system that is now fundamentally integrated into modern human survival? Think about that the next time you find yourself reaching for a snack, wondering if it's really you making the choice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.